figuring out how to ask a research question, how to take a research question, develop it over time, allow it to evolve, is a crucial part of a successful humanities analytics project. As we'll see, one of the key utilities, one of the reasons you want a research question is that it's a way to keep a humanities analytics project on track. It's not just an epistemically good thing to do. It's not just something that will help you ask better questions, will get you better forms of knowledge, but it's also useful as a way to bring a collaboration together and keep it moving in a way that benefits everybody, that allows everybody's individual ideas and talents to contribute to the success of the project as a whole. So research questions, if we were to come up with the primary skill, the skill that precedes all of the other skills in humanities analytics, well before we get to the technical problems of a statistical analysis or a computational problem, how to set up a data analytics pipeline, well before we get to those is this much deeper, much harder problem of how to phrase a good research question and how to develop one over the course of an investigation. So in this series of videos, we'll do two things. First, I'll tell you what a research question is, and then I'll give you a series of examples of both good questions and bad questions with a view towards allowing you to perfect and develop over time your own skills. So first, definitions. What is a research question? A research question is a succinct, meaning literally less than 25-word sentence, literally ending in a question mark, that helps organize your investigations, directs your attention, and keeps everybody on board. So it's this red, this blue, and the orange that are critical features. This is what a research question will do. It will prevent you from wasting too much time. It'll prevent you from spiraling out in too many different directions. It will draw your attention, so it won't just tell you what not to do, but it will also tell you where to look. And this critical aspect, it's so crucial for collaborations. Having the research question be explicit, be something that's out there for everyone to share, is important for keeping everybody on board, for everybody's efforts to be directed in a synergistic fashion. So, but beyond that, right, research questions are enormously varied. They're endless. They are, in a way, the meat of scholarship and science itself. So if we look at this sort of playful example we had in a previous lecture about what's going on in the blurbs on the back of Rebecca Spang's book, sitting in there in a sort of nascent inchoate form are a whole bunch of possible questions or possible research questions that one could start trying to answer. So, at different scales of focus, you might say, look, there's a research question in here. What do academics value, right? Where did the academic blurb come from? What are the genres of praise, right? If you were presented with somebody who, handed you a blurb on the back of a book and sort of started talking about it, you might say, well, I don't know, sitting in here, what you brought me, it seems like there's a whole bunch of potential research questions. So let's give some examples, right? And one of the key aspects of a research question is that they tend to evolve over time. So if we begin with the Rebecca Spang blurb, one possible research question is, where did this thing come from, right? What's the origin of the 20th century academic monograph blurb, right? Sitting behind that question, maybe at a slightly larger scale, is this sociology of knowledge, almost philosophical question. What do academics actually think like good work is? And so this middle question, this middle scale question, you might think of as a new lens on that larger problem, right? So we have this broad research question, what do academics think makes for a good piece of work? We have this narrower one, where did the 20th century blurb come from? And over time, as you try to answer that question, whether that's through standard or traditional historical methods, or whether it's through some computational analysis, in the course of trying to answer that question, the question itself might evolve. So for example, at some point you might make this discovery, which is, wow, when we're looking at the 20th century academic blurb, all of our metrics, something weird happens in 1965, and now all of a sudden you have this research question that's evolved out of the original one, right? Which you would never have thought to ask coming in, but simply because you tried to answer the one in the middle has now given you've uncovered something that now needs to be answered. So going from this very broad thing, which is understandable to basically anybody, whether it's a grant officer, a dean, or a colleague, right? From this large question, getting further and further specific, more and more specific over time, also in the end can often illuminate the large question. So a research question, the trajectory of a research question over the course of an investigation often involves narrowing, as you sort of understand what your data can do, what the archive can do, what the real points of issue are, and over time, even what the real sort of problems, the surprises are. But as that question narrows, often near the end of an investigation, you find that you've made a contribution to a far broader question, one that you might have begun with, or one that you realize is actually sitting behind in some almost like psychoanalytic way all the time. That kind of question, right? So even on a larger scale than the sociology of academia, than the history of a field of knowledge, the study of academic blurbs may in fact be contributing to this really deep, broad, almost literary question of how people tell stories about excellence. So what we're getting at here is, first of all, giving you examples of different research questions, but also giving you a sense that the research question you come in with is almost certainly not going to be the research question you leave with. And not only that, but even the one when you've narrowed it down, you've gotten the thing, you've gotten your answer for that question, the thing that you're really answering, the big thing that you're making a contribution to may be quite unexpected. We find this all the time in humanities analytics. We don't quite know where the research question is going to lead us over time, although we certainly have to pretend that when we apply for grants. So here's another example. This is one sequence of research questions as they might evolve over the course of an investigation. Here's another example, right? Here's my research question. I'm really interested in how people praise things. So a couple problems with this research question. The first is it's not actually a question, right? What you've done here is say, well, there's something I'm interested in. But you work this out over time, and you might say, okay, look, I went to the cafe, I thought about this. Given the kind of data I have, given how much time I have, I think actually, you know what? Maybe I want to ask this question. What genres of praise can be found in the 20th century academic blurb? So that's a research question. It's not too bad. In the process of trying to answer that question, you may in fact make a discovery. So as you're dealing with the data that's come in, for example, your gigantic stack of blurbs from every academic monograph in the last 100 years, as you're kind of going through that, looking for patterns, looking for distinct ways in which people praise, you might say, actually, look, I made this discovery, which is in 1920, the rhetoric of praise, the genre was about discovery. Everybody was using metaphors and analogies about uncovering or sailing off into a new land and discovering something. And then around 1980, we no longer have this language of discovery. We have instead all these words and tropes and semantics associated with brilliance and illumination and lenses, references to light and perception, right? So now you've begun with this question, what genres of praise can be found? And looking at genres of praise, you may discover, oh, look, there's this discovery genre and there's this enlightenment genre. And if you get really lucky, maybe these are segregated in time. And now you can start to ask questions about how and why the discovery genre gave way to the enlightenment genre. Of course, that research question, that very focused one now, it's the product of a set of discoveries you've made by asking previously increasingly focused questions. The answer to how the language of discovery gave way to the language of enlightenment, if that's indeed what happened. We have a sort of cartoon fantasy discovery here, right? But if that's exactly what happened, then in answering that, you will in fact not only successfully nail your question, but you will also answer research questions that are far more broad, far more general, far more of interest to people well beyond the narrow group of friends of yours who are all interested in academic blurbs. So these are two examples of the evolution of questions over time, the shift between big general themes or big general questions and narrow directed focused things, and the way in which these kind of co-evolve with each other. Let's have a little fun now, because one way to learn about how good questions work, how to get better at asking good questions, is to look at bad questions and see what's gone wrong. So I'm going to give you now a series of examples of questions, of bad research questions, things that at first glance you're like, oh, that's great, let's do that, right? But I promise you, will turn out over time that these are actually total disasters. So the most common failure mode of a research question in humanities analytics is something along the lines of, can method X do thing Y? Why do people end up asking this kind of question? Oftentimes, they're in the faculty club, and you have an English professor and you have a computer scientist, and the English professor says, oh, or maybe the computer scientist says, oh, we have this new algorithm and we can spot when, people are going to go on a Twitter rant. And then the English professor says, oh, I have all of these like angry letters in the Edinburgh Review where, poetry critics are yelling at each other. And, can your method detect when someone's going to say something mean in a letter to the Edinburgh Review? So this is fun. It's like the Lego brick approach to scholarship. The problem is it's a terrible question, because the answer is one of two things. The answer is either yes, okay, cool, like, cool story, bro, right? Computers are cool. Method X can do thing Y, okay. If the answer is no, okay, well, oh well, sorry it didn't work, and also your tenure packet is due, right? So now you're in trouble because you spent a year on this. So good questions, and maybe one way to say is, good questions, in contrast to this question, good questions tend to be interesting regardless of the answer. When you have a research question, try to think of all the possible answers, and they all better be interesting. In this case here, neither one is interesting, right? If method X can do thing Y, then it's at best kind of a kind of amusing thing to tell somebody over coffee. If the answer is no, then it's even less interesting. It's, well, no, but there's no reason that it should or should not, right? It was developed for Twitter. Why should it work on the Edinburgh Review? The other aspect here, the thing that's sort of missing in this question implicitly, which a good question will have in play, is that you want the question to connect to big ideas in the field. So whatever the thing Y is, this question here isn't really getting at it. It's looking at a problem, it's looking at some feature, let's say, of interest to scholars in the humanities, but not in a very deep way. We'll come back to this. We'll give you an example of how a variation on method X can do thing Y, how a variation on this actually can work, but for now, don't do this. It's the most common, at least in my experience, it's the most common failure mode. It's usually the first thing that somebody asks, because oftentimes they meet a computer scientist or you're a computer scientist and you've had this, and you say, well, this clearly has to be useful beyond its domain. More bad questions. What's up with X? So this is a bad question. It's a start. The problem is it's just unfocused. You've specified a domain of interest, but you haven't gone any further, right? So a good question is something that narrows things down, right? It puts your colleagues on the same page. A good question directs your attention to something new. It draws your attention to something else or something within the domain X that you said you're interested in. So a better variation on this, a way to unfold the question, what's up with X, right? Shakespeare, what's up with Shakespeare? A way to unfold that is, well, at the very least, what's up with this feature of X? What's up with tragedies in Shakespeare? At the very least, you've gotten a little bit further than what's up with Shakespeare. What's up with the use of high versus low diction in Shakespeare, right? By drawing your attention to some feature, you can make a little bit of progress. Your research question can become better and more, in this case, more focused. Another variation on what's up with X that often works better is, why did X happen? Or how does X happen? Or when does X happen? What's up with major changes in artistic taste? Well, who knows? Why do these changes happen? How do these changes happen? Under what conditions or when do these changes happen? Those are better, more refined versions of a research question that may be too unfocused, that gives you no purchase on where to begin. Yet more bad questions. We have this big data set that costs someone $1 million. So there's only one answer to this question. The answer is yes. Yes, we do. It's, of course, a deeply dissatisfying question. And one way to see why this is a sort of dissatisfying question, it's a very common one, right, that people end up asking, often because people create archives. In fact, we often digitize things without really knowing why we want to digitize them. This is a kind of common problem that hopefully not you, but somebody somewhere in some government agency will have spent $1 million to create an archive and no one knows what to do with it. Good questions, in fact, go the other direction. Good questions put the ideas ahead of the evidence. Right? I understand it. Right? It is okay to be inspired by the creation or the existence of a new digitized archive. That absolutely, like, this is the origin of many fantastic pieces of work that I've been involved with. Everybody has archive lust. It's okay. It's that kind of excitement that, it gets your blood up. That's wonderful. It's also often the way you'll begin formulating a research question. You'll have your attention drawn to a field simply because that archive exists. However, nobody will love your archive as much as you do. What they will love are the ideas, the big conceptual questions, the big challenges, the big sort of the problems, the analysis that the evidence makes possible. Right? So begin with the ideas, not with the evidence. At least when all is said and done and you have to give the talk, begin with the ideas. Yet more bad questions. This is an example of can method X do thing Y. It's still bad, but here we go. X is a well-known problem, X is a well-known fact in our field. Everybody knows, every historian of this knows X. Can a computer, potentially with a really sexy archive, can a computer detect it? So Rebecca Spang and I have called this the King Lear problem. The King Lear problem is, after 3 years, you are able to say the following. I've trained a pattern recognition system on Shakespeare's plays. I have this 8-level neural network. It's PyTorch. We stole $100,000 from the history department, and we ran it on the Amazon cloud. And we've done this, and it turns out that King Lear is a tragedy. The problem with this is we already knew this, right? We already knew that King Lear is a tragedy. And no one really cares that a computer can know that thing too. They might be impressed, they might be amused by it, but there's no benefit, there's no advance, there's no deepening of our knowledge of Shakespeare, or in fact, the algorithms for text classification that comes from being able to provide this answer. There's a parallel problem to the King Lear problem, which is the problem play problem. It's the exact same thing as the King Lear problem, just from a different angle. In Shakespeare, there are these, we have comedies, we have tragedies. We also have these things that we call problem plays, and it's like, are they comedies? They have some features of comedies. Are they tragedies? They have some features of tragedies, like Winter's Tale is an example. So the problem play problem is I've trained a pattern recognition system on Shakespeare's plays, and it turns out that Winter's Tale is a tragedy. In this case, you may have provided an answer that people don't have. In this case, however, the failure is that you haven't justified it. You may have given people knowledge, but it's not justifiable knowledge. So they have a belief. If you beat them over the head enough, they might say, fine, Winter's Tale is a tragedy. I believe your computer. But you haven't actually given them any reasons to do so. And the practice of scholarship is in large part the practice of giving reasons to believe things. That said, this is actually not as bad a question as it looks. It's a form of can method X do thing Y. In some ways, it's even worse, right? We already knew it, but it contains the seed of a good question, potentially, because you can maybe get an answer like the following. What features of King Lear are tragedy-like? So it isn't just, okay, my text classification system tells you that King Lear is a tragedy. It may, however, be the case that with some work, some technical work, some philosophical, conceptual thinking the problem through, you may be able to figure out, the machine is telling us it thinks that King Lear is a tragedy on the basis of this or that feature. And once we have a sense of what the features are, the features that are triggering that classification algorithm, the features that are triggering that detection, may in fact help us understand more deeply what a tragedy is. It may open up the question within the literary sciences or literary scholarship about the nature of tragedy in a new way. So that may potentially be a source of power, answering a well-known question. On the one hand, it's often this, unfortunately, it can often turn into a very condescending thing, right? The computer scientist says, I've discovered that King Lear is a tragedy. The English professor says, well, I already knew that. The computer scientist says, yeah, but you didn't really know. Now the computer has validated your knowledge. This is never a successful way to sell anything to anybody by telling them that you're smarter than them. But if you're able to take that algorithm and pull it apart in a way, and David and I will give examples of how to do this, to say why the algorithm is making those decisions, what the detection pattern is, sometimes called interpretable machine learning, then you may actually be able to make some progress. You may be able to make a contribution to our understanding, our interpretation, our reflection on, in this example, Shakespearean tragedy. So a shorter way to say this, or a kind of heuristic, is that good questions empower and advance the field. They don't just computerize it. They don't just replicate something that a scholar in the humanities already knows. The replication may be a crucial step. The fact that your algorithm, roughly speaking, matches the classifications made by, over the course of the, the history of the field, that may be something you want, but it can't be where you end. Something more has to happen. All right, yet more bad questions. Sometimes you will end up with a research question that looks like this. In order to understand Machiavelli's prince, you have to understand the historiography of not just the context of Machiavelli, but there's been a couple eras in our understanding, and these shifted, and there's this thing called the Cambridge School, right? So this kind of thing, which people in the humanities, we all do, scientists do as well, right? This is a great way to begin a lecture. Right? This may end, at the end of 17 hours, at the end there might be this question mark that is the world's greatest question mark of all time, right? It's like Hegel, this is great, right? You've now posed this amazing question, but it is not a research question, and the way we understand it, technically it's not a research question because it's more than 25 words, but the reason it fails is that it's not what we might say exoteric. It won't help you connect with your collaborators, right? You're a political theorist, you can phrase, you might be able to squeeze whatever your question is into 25 words, right? So you may be able to shrink this down, but only through the use of jargon, assumptions shared, really narrow technical assumptions shared by others in your particular subdiscipline. And what that means is that you can't, when you're sitting around after 3 exhausting hours with your collaborator, maybe you're the statistician and your collaborators in literature, maybe you're the historian, your collaborators in computer science, who knows, right? At the end of 3 exhausting hours, you need to be like, well, what question are we trying to answer? And you need to have a 25-word thing that people can all understand, that people can all get on the same page on really quickly, so that you can redirect yourself, so that you can actually take advantage, so you can keep that conversation going, and you can take advantage of all of the skills and ideas and interests that people have. Right? So this is probably the most contentious thing that I've noticed in teaching people to phrase a research question, is that in general, every piece of knowledge, every research question unfolds and ramifies continuously. Every research question is in a much larger epistemic context. One sense, that's why a good research question is a good research question. But the question itself has to be phrased in such a way that everybody in the room, not just people in your particular discipline, that everybody in the room can grasp it. So good questions are short, not to harp on this. They're 25 words or less, and they're exoteric. They don't need a lot of background and introduction. They don't need somebody to buy in to an enormous number of values. You don't need somebody to also have been in your particular PhD program in order for them to grasp and be enthused and be excited about that question. So our definition and example, this has been the goal of these series of videos here, of research questions. An important thing to say is it's phrasing a research question in the way we've introduced it here is not a necessary skill to get a PhD in the humanities. Right? You may, if you're a faculty in the humanities or a graduate student, you may have never in your career ever phrased a research question. Sometimes it's common for people to say, well, what's your question? Research question's a sub-case of that. But very often, because of the nature of education and work and scholarship, we're never potentially that explicit. It's in part because research questions are, well, partly because work is often solo, so the research questions may be implicit in one's mind. It's also in part because most of our education, most of PhD training certainly, happens with a group of people, all of whom share an enormous amount of background knowledge. So by the time you're ABD, you're surrounded by people who have been in your field for maybe even 10 years, beginning with their undergraduate career and entering graduate school. You're surrounded by people with whom you share an enormous shorthand, and the research questions are so implicit that you may never have actually drawn them up, to the surface to look at. And it's very unlikely that you've drawn them up in such a way that you could then show them to a friend of yours who is in a completely different discipline. Probably the time that you were most introduced, or the time you had the most practice with developing research questions, is early on in your graduate school career when you were still drinking at the grad student bar. Right? So I would say don't be embarrassed, or don't worry if you struggle with formulating a research question in a humanities analytic project. That said, you should struggle because it's a great skill. It's an important skill to develop over time. It's not just a way to keep yourself on track. It's not just a way to make sure that you're asking and therefore answering really important questions that are meaningful to others. It's not just a way to make sure that everybody in your collaboration is participating equally. It's also, in fact, a way to make your research communicatable to people outside academia itself. So developing skills in asking a research question and framing and allowing these to develop over time is, if you're good at this, you will also be really good at teaching your work. You'll also be really good at writing popular articles about your work and communicating the value of that work and giving the value of that work to people even well outside the academic domain. Being able to understand that the last 3 years of your life were devoted to answering the question, how do people talk about excellence? Being able to say that is not just something that will make your research deeper, for example, but it will also make your research comprehensible to those around you, and of course, including to the people who supported you and funded you. Implicitly in this whole time, we've given all these examples. We've walked through how they develop, how they succeed, how they fail. So they're sitting there. It's like, how do you find a good research question? The short answer to that is, if call me, tell me. If you found the answer to this question of all questions, let me know. The reason I say that is 90% of good scholarship, at least in my experience in human analytics and these kinds of fields, 90% of it is actually this stage. Finding the good research question and allowing it, knowing how to develop it, how to focus it, how to broaden it, is almost all of the work. In the end, a really well-phrased research question makes everything else a technical problem. It may be, a tedious one, like you have to look through 100 books. It may be a technically challenging one, like I need to find, all the word pairs with these qualities. But having formulated that, you can almost just, parcel out the labor in, kind of an Adam Smith pin factory fashion. The good research question itself, this is the real challenge. More seriously, no one really knows, but one way to develop your skills in asking and answering good research questions is to practice and is to work with others. The sort of challenge of a research question is often the brevity and the depth. And when you're working with other people and phrasing research questions to each other, others are far better judge of whether or not you brought the implicit interest of what's in your head to the surface in an exoteric, comprehensible way. So, all right. So, where are we at the end of this series of videos on research questions? Given you some examples. One example more related to sort of the history of praise. The other more to the genre, the literature, the rhetoric of praise. What are good research questions? They're interesting regardless of the answer. Generally, a research question that the answer is either yes or no, they're usually not good, although sometimes yes can be interesting and no can be interesting for the same question, in which case, go for it. Good research questions connect to big ideas in your field. They drive at some of the motivating, at the largest scales, they are things that, if you're a historian, historians care about. They put your colleagues, meaning your collaborators, on the same page. They're comprehensible at whatever stage of your work you're at with your colleagues. You can sit down and all say, okay, in 10 words or less, what are we doing? What are we trying to answer this morning? Good research questions tend to direct your attention to something in the field, something new in the field, something perhaps unexpected. And finally, good research questions empower and advance the field. They're not simply in this failure mode of humanities analytics. They don't just computerize it. They don't just tell people what they already knew plus a computer. In the next series of lectures, we're going to talk about one of the ways you answer good research questions, and that focuses, in the case of humanities analytics, it focuses on the discovery of patterns. If you take a look in the assignments for these lectures, you'll have examples and challenges to come up with research questions of your own, to retrospectively identify research questions in projects that you've been involved in, and in projects that form some of the canonical examples of excellence in your own field. Thank you.